Chapter 29 of Your Psychic Powers and How to Develop Them. Recording by Arnie Horton. Your Psychic Powers and How to Develop Them. By Hereward Carrington. Chapter 29 The Difficulties of Communication. The process of communication is doubtless far more difficult and complicated than the average person believes, and is even more complicated than most spiritualists believe. As stated in a previous chapter, one of the great objections to the reality of spiritualism urged in the past is that, if true, many more persons must communicate than now appear to do so, and that of the thousands who die, more must come back than the few who return through mediums. It was there pointed out that the reason for this consists partly in the fact that "good communicators" are comparatively rare, and that there is necessarily a peculiar psychical condition which enables them to communicate through mediums. In addition to this, a medium must be present at the time that an effort to communicate is being made, and in many cases the recipient of the message must also be reaching out to receive it before it can be given satisfactorily. In other words, the sender and the receiver of the message must stretch out their mental arms, so to say, at the same moment before they can shake hands across the great gulf, and if only one does so, he fails to reach the one on the other side. Factors affecting communication. It has frequently been pointed out by scientific investigators of spiritualism that only after the reality of the facts has been proved does their detailed study begin. For example, supposing that a spirit can write through an entranced medium, she giving the messages in automatic writing. The fact once admitted, the scientific study of the case will only have begun, and such questions as these would then have to be answered. To what extent is the medium's spirit disconnected from the body while the communication is taking place? What is the degree of mental activity of the medium's spirit during the communication? Does the communicating intelligence act directly on the brain and nervous centers of the medium, or in a more roundabout manner? And if the former, upon what brain centers does the intelligence act, and how? If a communicator was in life a good visualizer, or had a good memory, etc., would these factors assist him in the process of communication, and if so, how? These and many similar questions would have to be answered, and it is upon questions such as these that many psychical researchers have bent their energies for some time past. It is probable that several hundred years will have to elapse before these questions can be answered fully and the facts explained in detail. Difficulties of the communicating spirit. Let us enumerate some of the difficulties which a communicating spirit probably has to contend with in sending messages through mediums to the living. There is much evidence to show that the process of communication is a very difficult one, for as soon as a spirit gets in contact with the medium and begins to transmit messages, he becomes more or less exhausted and suffocated, so to speak, by the dense aura or atmosphere with which he is called upon to come into contact. In many instances, we read that spirits have to go away several times during the course of a séance, to revive themselves and afterwards return, refreshed and clear-brained, to continue the communications. They experience great difficulty in holding their thoughts together connectedly during the process of communication. This does not mean that they are ordinarily in this confused state, but very often, as soon as they come into contact with the medium's psychic atmosphere and magnetism, they become confused, and their minds tend to wander as they would in delirium or in a state of trance. It is because of this that many of the messages we receive commence well but afterwards dwindle off into incoherence and triviality. Why many messages are trivial. This question of triviality, however, is often misunderstood. The objection is raised that spirits, if they really communicate, would tell us something more important than they usually do. As a matter of fact, however, this is only true in a certain sense. The ordinary social conversation between "spirits in the flesh" is not as serious as it might be, and it has been shown by actual experiment that human beings, when called upon to prove their own identity to another, do deliberately choose trivial incidents by means of which to identify themselves. Another point is that trivial incidents serve best to prove identity, as some great philosophical discourse might be given by any intelligence, either in or out of the body, and would prove nothing to one longing to hear from his own dear one. In such a case, personal, detailed, and, so to say, trivial messages are often the most striking and the most convincing. The very triviality of many messages received through mediums is, therefore, their strongest point and not their weakest. In addition to this, there are, as we know, innumerable books written by spirits containing philosophical, scientific, and religious truths of great value and importance. Influence of the medium's organism. Another reason why communication is doubtless difficult is that the communicating spirit is unused to the bodily organism of the medium. All of us have certain mental and physical habits which we form, and it is easier for us to do certain things in certain ways after we have done them in that manner a few times. If you were suddenly transplanted into the body of another person, say one of the opposite sex, you would find great difficulty in manipulating that body so as to extract from it the best results, to think clearly and to speak and write clearly when expressing your thoughts. It is precisely this difficulty which the communicating intelligence experiences in trying to communicate with us through unfamiliar bodies. Many of the habits and "tricks," so to say, of the medium creep into the messages, which are consequently often more or less similar to the language employed by the medium. This proves only that the spirit has to employ the medium's mental and bodily habits as best it can during the process of communication, and that it is not as easy and concise as many persons imagine. Symbolism necessary. Another difficulty presented is that the conditions on the "other side" are doubtless so different from any which exist here that they have to be explained in roundabout and symbolic language. If you had to explain color to a blind man, you would find great difficulty in doing so. If you had to explain the feelings experienced while giving psychometric tests to one who had never experienced them, you would also find considerable difficulty. It is much the same in this case. There are no immediate analogies which can be drawn, and the result is that symbolism and a language which appears to us vague and unsatisfactory is often employed in describing the other side of life and the conditions which prevail therein. Difficulties of names and dates. Names and dates furnish great difficulty for returning spirits. Dates, because of the fact that time is not recognized by them in the same way that it is with us. Names, for the reason that they do not represent concrete pictures or meanings, but are as a rule only a combination of letters having a certain sound. The word "chair" calls up to the mind a certain picture which can be visualized. On the other hand, the name "Robinson" calls up no such picture, except perhaps the memory image of some friend of yours by that name. If that memory picture is revived in the communicator's mind, the medium can see this and describe it, which is precisely what he does. But the name "Robinson" cannot be presented in picture form, the most common form of representation, and consequently is not easily communicated. As explained in the chapter on dreams, our hearing centers are less developed than our sight centers, and for this reason verbal messages are less easily given and received than pictured or visualized messages. The difficulty in receiving names is explained largely because of this fact. Communications immediately after death. For some days after death these difficulties are particularly great, and especially in the case of suicides. Dr. Hodgson, in his report of the case of Mrs. Piper, says, "that persons, just deceased, should be extremely confused and unable to communicate directly or even at all seems perfectly natural after the shock and wrench of death. Thus, in one case, the spirit was unable to write the second day after his death. In another case, a friend of mine, whom I may call D, wrote, with what appeared to be much difficulty, his name and the words, "I am all right, adieu," within 2 or 3 days after his death. In another case, F, he was unable to write on the morning after his death. A few days later, when a stranger was present with me for a sitting, he wrote 2 or 3 sentences, saying, "I am too weak to articulate clearly." And not many days later he wrote fairly well and quite accurately, dictating also to Madame Eliza, the amanuensis, an account of his feelings when finding himself amid new surroundings. Both D and F became very clear in a short time. D communicated frequently, later on, both by writing and speech." Other difficulties. Other difficulties remain, such as the probable inability of the communicating spirit to see the material world as we see it, especially at the time of communication; the difficulty of holding the mind together while communicating; the difficulty of manipulating the medium's organism; and the intra-cosmic difficulties which exist between this world and the next. Because of all these hindrances and impediments, spirits find great difficulty in direct communication, and because of these facts, messages are, comparatively speaking, few, and in so many cases inconclusive. When a good medium, a good communicator, and a sympathetic sitter get together, however, very striking and convincing results are obtained, as we know from the history of spiritualism. End of chapter 29.